In the last class, we discussed about two things. The first one is how to have event listeners in a functional component, and then how to add a state to a functional component, which is using the use state, which is a React hook. Use state is the first React hook that you learned, and you should already know what a React hook is. Okay, and today we will move on and create a new component which is called as new expense.jsx. Okay, new expense is the component which will gather the user input, which is basically a new expense, and then send it to the expense list and add it there. That's what we want to do. Okay, okay, so let me create this function, which is a form. I don't care about the action, and inside this we will have three inputs. One is of type text, and one is of type number, and another one is of type date. Let me write the placeholder for these two. And for this, we cannot have a placeholder, so we can have a label here. And this is for the date, and I will just write expense date. And I'll keep these two in a simple div. So that's it. Of course, I also want to have a button. Let's have a button. It says submit, and I will mention the attribute of type equals to submit. Now, whenever this button is clicked, submit button, all the values should be read from here, and it should be sent to the expense list, and a new expense should be rendered outside. Okay, let me run this application once. Okay, it's already running, so let's just see whether it's there. So here we have the output. Okay, I don't care about the styling part for today. You guys can style this out. The thing is, I want to read the values from these two input fields, of course, the date as well, and then I want to send it to expense list. How do we achieve this? In React, if you want to read the values from input fields, we store them in a state variable. This is because they keep on changing, right? The input fields, they always change, and we want them to be in a state maintained. Okay, for that, let's import the use state here. Now, for three inputs, I'm going to have three use state variables, meaning the use states. Const. The first one is the title, so const title, and then the set title. And this is going to be empty initially, and the same thing goes for the price. Let me take this out and make it as price. Finally, the date. Set date. I hope until here everything is clear, right? Once we have the state variables for all the three fields, let's read the values into these variables. We already know how to update the values of the state variables, right? Using the set functions. Now, in order to read values from input, you will try to trigger an event called as change event, meaning it will be triggered whenever you try to type something into the input fields. So let's have it here on change. Okay, and this accepts a function. Let's call this as title handler. Okay, and same thing goes to here as well on change. This is going to be price handler. Finally, the date handler. on change date handler. Every input function has on change attribute, which is an event listener. Okay, now let's try to create these functions as well. And this is an event listener function, so it gets event as its default argument. And let's take that. And now I want to make sure that we need a way to select this input fields and read the value from them. Because React is a declarative approach, we cannot directly select this and do anything. We shouldn't follow that pattern. We shouldn't go to document.query selector. We don't do it, right? So that's why this is the reason we do it like this. Okay, we basically take the event and we will find where it triggered, and from there we will try to read the value. If it is an input field, we will definitely get a value there, right? So of course, this event is here, event object, and because of that, we can find its target where it happened, right? Let's log it once, log e dot target. So this gives where this event actually occurred, which should be just this input itself, right? So let's come back here and let's refresh. Something might have gone wrong. Okay, price handler is not defined. Of course, we have not created all these functions yet. Let's create those as well. Const price handler, which is an empty function for now. It's also an event listener function. It gets event as by default. Date handler. Okay, let's check now. Of course, we have everything clear. Now, I want to start typing into the title. Let's click here. And if I hit A, we got an undefined one. Let's just check, something might be wrong here again. Okay, it's a spelling mistake, sorry. E dot target. Okay, so let's write B. Of course, we got the input field here. Clear? So this is what we wanted. Now we have the element being selected, which is an input element as well. So how do we read the value from input element? By its value attribute, right? All the input elements have the value attribute, so we can just use it. Value, right? Now everything that you type will be there. A, B, C. If you type C, you have A, B, C. That is the input value. Let's write D, E, F. On every keystroke, you are triggering the onChange event, and that will be like this. It will go to the event, get its target, and find the value that it has. That's how it does. Clear? Now, now we know how to access value, but where to store this now? We should store this in the state variable, right? Let me cut this and take this out. And instead of logging it here, I'll try to store set title, and I just have to do this. Okay, so now the value will be stored into the title variable or title state. Okay, the same thing we have to do it here. Set price and then set this. On the price handler, input will be this, and the value of this input will be stored into the price. The same thing should be done for the date as well. Clear? Now we need to handle the form submission. This is the complex part, and I want you guys to listen to this carefully. So whenever this form is submitted, I want to send this data to the expense list. Okay, but there is no direct way because app.jsx consists new expense and expense list. Okay, in the components tree, the first component is app.jsx, and it contains two children, which is expense list and new expense. There is no straightforward way to forward the value from new expense to the expense list bypassing the app.jsx. You have to take the expense value from the new expense, pass it to the app.jsx, and only then you are allowed to pass it to the expense list. Okay, so this is a very complex operation, right? So how do we even get the value from a new expense, right? So for this reason, in order to make it a bit simpler, I'm going to keep this dummy expenses in the app.jsx. Okay, so let me cut this out and paste it into app.jsx file. Okay, and I'm passing these values to the expense list as dummy expenses itself. Okay, so app has the dummy expenses and expense list needs the dummy expenses. So we forwarded it to the expense list. Now we just have to use it. Let me just destructure those here. Dummy expenses. Clear? So nothing should actually change here now. Everything works totally fine as before. The thing is, now we want to get the value from new expense to the app. Just one component, right? We have to lift it to just one component, not two. So that's what I wanted to do here. The thing is, in order to do that, even if we lift the value from new expense to the app and add it to the dummy expenses, it won't make any changes. This is because this dummy expense is a simple array, right? It's not a state. If it is not a state and if it changes, it doesn't really make any sense. Only a state change can trigger the function to be re-evaluated and return a new JSX with the updated values. So because of this, we want to make this dummy expense as a state. So there is a term for it called as we need to make this a stateful list, right? So how do we do it? It's pretty simple again. We just have to use the use state. Okay, so let's come back here. Const use state. Sorry, it's expenses, right? And then set expenses. Let's use the use state, and initial value of the expenses is the dummy expenses, right? Let's copy this and paste it here. But the thing is, when we want to pass this expense list, pass expenses to expense list, before we pass it as dummy expenses, let's just pass it as expenses. Okay, here as well, expenses. But the expense list is expecting dummy expenses, right? So let's make it to expect as expenses. Okay, instead of dummy expenses, let's replace it everywhere with expenses. I think this is the only place, right? So let's save it, and it should actually change nothing here, right? It's the same as before. But there is a benefit now. Our expenses is a stateful list now, and whenever we try to add a new value to it, it will trigger the re-rendering of our component, which will add a new expense. But the problem is our new expense is here in an entirely different component. We need to lift it from here, right? For this thing, we need to do three things. Okay, so I will just write it down here. The first thing that we need to do here is we need to create a function that accepts a value in a parent component. Okay, so here the parent component is app.jsx app, and we need to lift the value from new expense, which is a child component. Clear? So from wherever you want to lift the state, which is a value, which is these three values, so that component becomes a child, and from there you want to pick the value and shift it to app. So app becomes the parent. It usually embedding component, new expense is embedded in the app, right? So that is app is treated as the parent. Now you have to do what? So first thing is we need to create a function that accepts a value in parent component. We need to create that function here. And the second one is we need to pass it. We need to pass this function to the child component. Okay, so we need to pass this new function that we created into the child. The third thing is call the function inside child when it needs to send data, when it needs to send state value. Clear? That's it. This is the basic concept. Okay, so we need to have a function that accepts a value in parent component, and of course it can do whatever it wants to do with the value later on. Okay, so let me create a function here. So const accept expense. This is the function that we are creating it in parent component, which accepts the expense, right? So let me write expense. It's just a function definition now. And what does it do with this expense? Let's just log it, log the expense. Okay, and what is the second step? We need to pass this function, which is a accept expense, to the new expense, which is the child, right? So let's just pass it as a send expense name. Okay, and pass the accept expense. So observe here, I might have used two names. Of course, you can just simply pass it as accept expense itself or any name you want. But inside the child, which is new expense, you have to use this function as send expense. Okay, so let's come back here. The third step is call this function, which is send expense, when we want to send the state value, right? So when we want to send the value, when this submit button is clicked. Whenever this submit button is clicked, it triggers an event called as on submit event. Okay, so we can write form submit handler. Okay, so now let's create this function as well. Again, it's an event listener function. So let's just write it like this. And observe here, whenever you try to submit a form, it refreshes the page, right? Which is a problem thing. We won't be able to store these values. The entire application will be reloaded. We want to prevent the page to be refreshed and then pick up the values and pass it to the list. Okay, so in order to prevent the page refresh, you can stop the default behavior of the form submission by doing like this. So you can just simply write e dot prevent default. So this will uh, stop the page refreshing. Clear? Sorry. Let's just send the values now. How do we send the values that we have? Using the function that we received as a prop, right? So let's write the props here and come back here and pass it using props. So which is props dot send expense. And what is the expense here that we are sending? So if you observe here, the expense is basically a object, right? But we have title, price, date as a separate variables. So we will simply send a object with all the values, which is for title, we will simply send title. For price, we will simply send price. For date, we will simply send date. I hope this is clear. The only complicated thing here is we need to have an ID, right? Let's also have an ID. For ID, I'm going to go with simple numbers, like a random number from math dot random and multiplied with some big numbers. Okay, I will just keep it like this. It will create a random number. Okay, so now if we save it and come back here, okay, so let's have a title here as mobile of price some 10,000, and let's pick a date and click on submit. Observe here, we got a value which is an expense with the title of mobile and a price of 1000 and the date as this. From where? From the app.jsx, right? So we successfully picked up the value from new expense and shifted it to app.jsx file or app component, right? So this process is called as lifting the state up, meaning from the new expense to the app, right? Now, instead of logging it, I want to add it to the expenses list. But how do we add it? Using the set expenses, right? So instead of doing it, let's comment it out and use set expenses. And how do we add a new value to the expenses list? Because we depend on the previous value here, which is a old value expenses. To that, we want to add new one. We go with the functional form, right? In functional form, what do we have to do? We get the previous value as default, and here I need to return a new array with all the previous values and then a extra value which is this expense, right? So let's just write it here as expense. And why are we even returning a new array instead of going with the expense dot push? So you should know about how reference types and primitive types work. Okay, in reference type, in expenses, you actually store the address of the array where the values are stored. Instead of having the entire values, it actually stores the address. Okay, you always need to change the address, and when you return a new array, it changes the address. That will trigger the re-rendering of the component. If you just add it to the same array here with this without modificating the address, it won't trigger any state rendering. Clear? So that's why we will return a new array with all the previous values and a new expense. Right? Let's save it and come back and click on submit. So we have a new expense item. I hope everything is clear till here. So we learned two things: how to add the states for input fields, right, using the on change, and then how to lift the state, which is a new expense, from here to its parent, of course, and we need to have a stateful list as well. So that's it for this class.